Hey everyone, I'm back with another game that I played. Back to my regularly scheduled losses. So this is a game I played last week, and in it my opponent, we played this opposite side castling thing, which is usually pretty crazy, and White's gonna do these things, and I'm gonna do these things, and we have a wild game. But here my opponent didn't do that. They just played King B1 here, which is, the first move not covered in the course, and their idea was actually pretty simple. They're just going to try to trade off all of the pieces and prove that these four pawns are better than these three pawns. And that's exactly what happened. Along the way, there were some instructive points that I wanted to point out, I guess. Uh, so the first thing, right off the bat, I immediately played b5, which is actually already a mistake. It falls prey to an idea I've actually seen before, but I forgot, I guess. The problem with b5 is that it's not adequately supported, meaning that d5 can happen and undermine it, and then this pawn falls. So, for example, just d5, and what are we going to play? The best we can actually do is to play c5 and then just give this pawn up and say we wanted to do this because now we have an open file. And while that's technically true, we're just down a pawn and we're not going to get anything out of it. So instead of b5, it's better to prepare it and just play bishop to e6. I suppose I didn't feel super pressured to do that because normally they play h4 and then we play bishop e6 and we have to induce this king to b1. But since king b1 was played already, I didn't like it, and I wanted to play b5 immediately because I didn't want c5. I thought if bishop e6, c5 or c4 comes, but c4 is not. I mean, is probably what should be played, and then we play a6, and the idea is we're going to prepare b5 this way, and we've got control over the d5 square, and we have control over b5. So, for example, h4, h5. They can try to play f3 because they're trying to get this up the board. We can again prepare further, controlling this b5 square and keeping an eye on d5. Then the rooks come to the middle. We bring our rooks to the center, and we just have a standard game. We're going to play kind of in the center now because this c4 pawn really kind of makes it difficult for us to get our breaks in. If we play b5 at sort of the wrong time, maybe even c5 happens, and everything's just shut down. And maybe white will get a counterattack here. So we're just playing in the center, and we have some kind of obnoxious ideas. So, for example, if this queen tries to slide over and put pressure on this diagonal, well, we can actually just take on c4. We get the rook. And we just have a pretty comfortable game where we're maybe even slightly better this way. Instead, I played b5, and I got lucky because my opponent did not play d5. And now I play bishop to e6. We've essentially kind of transposed back. So here, white played bishop to f4. And when I said white's just wanting to make a lot of trades and try to prove that their queen side is going to be stronger than ours. And it's kind of a pain in the butt plan to face. So it turns out here that, there's not really any good way I can stop this capture. I mean, I can drop back, but I mean, that's sort of annoying. I played a5, just trying to continue on with my attack. But knight g6 probably makes more sense. It does force this bishop to do something, probably takes. And the key is that now we have some control over the f4 square, and we're going to limit additional trades. If white wants to play knight f4, which they played in the game, they got to grab this guy first. We'll take, and this is a pretty favorable exchange for us, because we like to keep this bishop versus the knight. There's pawns on both sides of the board. The middle is fairly fluid. So say knight f4 now, we go bishop bishop f5, and we're free to continue on with our attack on this side. We do have a nice minor piece. Our king is perfectly safe. This would probably be a way to play, and we're maybe doing slightly better. Instead, I just full steam ahead with a5. And they, of course, took, and then played bishop f4. And again, I'm stuck with the same sort of quandary. Like, I didn't really want to give up my light squared bishop because it points very nicely at the white king. But I didn't know what to do. So I played a4, which seems natural enough. I want to play a3. But actually, this kind of brings us to the next sort of key point. The problem with a4, is that white could just play a3, or they can play c3. c3 is maybe even better. and they've really kind of fixed our pawns. So it's better to start with this b4 move. And the point is now, if you play either one of those, well, it's just going to capture, and I'm going to have an open line. And this is a lot more restrictive of the camp, of the white camp, and maybe we'll bring this pawn up, and then we have the possibility to play b3, which is going to force some line open. Whereas if you go back and see here, they can play here. We can't necessarily force anything open. So I looked at a line with b4. Yeah, they capture, we capture back. They bring the bishop in to try to go for further trades. We can bring this knight out to f4. This is similar to what happened in the game. They kick us. We come to d5. They would insist on this trade. And we don't have to be in a big rush on the king side, or sorry, on the queen side. We can take a minute to sort of shore up our own king side with something like g6, h4, h5, and after f4, now we can bring our rook across, and I mean our king can go to g7 anytime. We can play f5 if we want to, and we just have like a rock solid king side position, and there's no real breaks for white, so we can try to create our own breaks. So king a1, it's hard to find a better move. So say a4, bishop takes, this pawn takes, and yeah, we definitely have more fluidity on our side of the board. We're probably a bit better. It's not clear how white's going to be able to get a healthy pass pawn out of this after we make some more trades. And yeah, this is just a better way to play. So point number 2 is it's probably often a good idea to lead with the b pawn against 3 pawns all setting on the second rank here. Instead, I chose a4 and captures, and bishop f5. And again, white's plan has been incredibly clear. It's almost embarrassing how easy it was for white to win this game, because they literally just traded everything off, and then I went to town. Here I played knight a4, trying to avoid trades. I was sort of desperately trying to avoid trades, because I know that that's generally what we're supposed to do. And so my idea was to head to d5. But, I kind of missed an opportunity to play a3, which was my whole point of playing a4. Now a3, say they go ahead and do take, we can take back with the pawn, and we've made our own pawn sort of healthy. This pawn's not actually that weak, because maybe we'll play e5, maybe we'll play king f7. It's already twice defended, only once attacked, and we have this sort of thorn over here. So say white tries to prevent it this way, well, we can just capture, and we have established now an open a file. This pawn is probably weak. It's difficult to know what to do. If instead this happens, well, we would be quite happy here. I mean, we can actually even just go grab this pawn, but that's pretty terrifying. We could even just cement here and know that these dark squares are going to cause lots of problems later down the road. And again, it's not going to be so easy for white to create a queenside majority anymore. And this king is perpetually going to feel a little bit unsafe as long as these queens remain on the board, which is sort of foreshadowing for later on in the game. I chose to play knight f4, trying to avoid some trades. I got kicked. I came to the d5, and now c3. And I no longer have any more chances to play this way. I mean, I could have tried to play, so I did play g6. I could try to play a3 now, but it's not really going to lead me anywhere. So, for example, white could just trade off a pair of rooks, try to trade another pair of rooks. I will try to decline. And now b4 happens, and this is like a rock-solid structure. The king can even come up and defend. Our own pawn is shutting out the rook. c5 is never going to happen. I mean, we're probably not worse, but we're certainly not any better. So I didn't go for this. Instead played g6, wanting to sort of kick the bishop out of the way. I wasn't sure how to proceed, honestly. I just wanted to put my king on g7 and just sort of set up this sort of safe structure that I know, that we looked at in an earlier variation. The bishop drops back, I play king g7, trades rooks, and comes to try to trade a second rook, and I decided I was going to put the rook here on e6 and try to, I said if you want to trade, you're going to undouble, which I thought made some sense. h4, h5, and notice all of these pawns that I've got here on light squares. This is going to end up being a bit of a problem because white has a light square bishop. And one of the questions I had when I was looking at this game is, didn't end up actually wanting my pawns on light squares. It ended up creating huge problems for me because we got into an endgame, white had a light squared bishop, and they just chomped all my pawns. But then we always hear this advice that says, put your pawns on the opposite color or on the same color as your opponent's bishop to restrict it, which makes sense. And that makes sense in a middle game, but a lot less sense in an end game. But here it's complicated because are we in an end game or are we in a middle game? I mean, this still kind of looks like a middle game with a set of queens and rooks and a minor piece apiece. So here it's fine, but we just have to be really careful about how we go into an endgame. Here white played bishop to d3, and I played knight back to b6. I was afraid of c4, and the knight sets here pretty nicely to prevent this, but I'm certainly not playing for any sort of advantage anymore, which I don't suppose I even have one at this point. Maybe if I had done a few things differently with how I approached the king side, or maybe we could have played this knight g6 earlier, or sorry, not there, but here to avoid some trades, maybe I could have fought a bit more of an interesting game. Here they chose to take with the rook, and I took back with the queen, thinking I was going to get control of this file. And queen e2 was played, and now here's where I made a huge mistake. I let the queen set here, and we were just talking about where your pawn should be in the end game versus a middle game. And it's clear if we trade the queens, we are absolutely in an end game. There's no question. And if we are in an end game, this minor piece is so far superior to ours. All of these pawns are on light squares, which means they're going to be susceptible to attack. And there's pawns on both sides of the board, so the bishops can be able to switch sides and create problems. White has a clearer path with the king to come help. And I mean, the main thing is that we can't trade the queens here, which is what I did. In fact, I put another pawn on a light square. But honestly, the situation's not so bad. If we just play, like, say, queen d5, they come try to trade, we say, no, we're not going to trade. And we can kind of just set tight here. We can move our queen kind of back and forth along the d file, wait and see what white does. And as long as we have queens on the board, it's going to be really hard for this majority to get rolling because this king can become kind of weak. And the queen can really help defend these pawns and create some counter threats. So leaving the queens on the board gives us fairly comfortable equality. Whereas after I play f5 and the queens get, sorry, not that way, f5, queens get traded, now it's almost hilarious how simple of a loss this was. So it brings the king up, I bring my king up, prevents me from playing e5, which is what I wanted. Would have loved to have played e5 and liquidated a few pawns. So I'm going to bring my king over to come help. Now I'm already in trouble. Wasn't sure how to handle it. I tried to keep things closed because I thought that would favor. Turns out it's not going to make all that much of a difference. I did have an idea to try to fix this pawn on a light square, which I thought might help me. Just a3, and I mean, I have to capture. The problem is if I push past, this king is just going to walk straight in. So I took, and I played c5, which was my idea. And I thought that if captures, that I could set a knight there and maybe transfer my king there, and we would be doing great. I would have really solid opportunities, especially if I could get my king to c5. It turns out that's all totally bogus. It just brings the king up. I brought my king, and the bishop comes back, just sort of touching it. But that's not really the point. The point is, my whole plan is to wait here with these guys, or play back and forth, and just try to hold the structure and say, you've got no way in, which is not exactly true. It might work if we didn't have these pawns. Maybe. So I'm going to continue my plan, and white they just wasted a move with the king to get the right tempi they needed. Now this bishop comes in. I've got to move now because I can't put the king back where I want. I need this king to stay in touch here, and I can't. So it just comes here, and now I'm in zugzwang. I've got to give up material. Either the king's got to move, which is going to allow this pawn to get taken, which means the knight has to move, which means I lose this pawn. All of a sudden we got 3 connected passers. So it was crazy how easy this got to be for white once I traded queens. So again, we have 3 things to take away from here. One, when you play b5, make sure d5 is not strong. I mean, that's the first big one. is make sure that, yeah, just pay attention to this d5 idea. Number two was when, instead of playing a4 here, leading with the b pawn, leading with the center pawn against these three pawns, it's going to allow us a lot more options for how to attack. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, because none of the mistakes I made earlier were so bad, the game was actually pretty equal, or the computer even thought I was slightly better for a lot of it. But at the very end here, instead of trading queens after I played queen takes here, understanding that this bishop and plus this queenside majority are really, really dangerous, and that we have to leave the queens on the board. Not f5, but instead, I mean, queen d6 is fine, here's fine, here's fine, anywhere that doesn't trade the queens. I didn't do that because I was like, oh no, I give up the I give up the e-file, but man, did I give up so much more. I didn't just give up the e-file whenever I traded queens. I gave up like the entire light squares on the board, plus I activated the king. And yeah, it's so much better if we just leave the queens on. This queen plus knight duo is quite strong. And yeah, if you take something away from this game, when you do get sort of traded down, try to keep the queens on the board. Generally try to keep as many pieces on the board as you can. Anyhow, as usual, there is a link to the library on chess.com that has the PGN with some notes in here. And head over to ChessGoals and check out the course if you want to try to play these kinds of games in yours. This one's not so exciting, but you know, white can take things in sort of a simple way, and it's important that we know how to handle that too. So I wish you guys the best. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.